I said I always wanted to do that. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us in such large numbers, also online and, of course, also here in the room, to our event, Sustainable Textiles, Making Fast Fashion Out of Fashion, which we organize as S&D together with my colleague Alessandra Moretti, who will join us on the second panel. We are really looking forward to the discussions we are having today because, as you know, I will present tomorrow the draft of the initiative report of the Parliament on the textile strategy, and I think it's a really good moment to get together all this knowledge that we have on different sides from the NGO world, from science, from the agencies, from the different institutions, but of course also from the industry side, so that we have all the knowledge that is already in the room, letting to be flood in the parliamentary process, into the lawmakers' decisions on how we will have a legislative framework that will deliver on the goal of making fast fashion out of fashion. So what I was told already since I jumped into the room, that there's a lot of happiness also to finally meet in person, because for me also being an MEP that was elected 2019, most of the meetings like this I had were on Zoom or on WebEx, on insert any program you want. So there has been a lack also of having faces and also statutes and impressions of people who you are working and sharing knowledge with. So very happy that we are also having this this real life part of this event, also having the room after this event for 30 minutes to exchange, which not is, of course, going against the people that are joining us online. So I don't have to tell you in this room that we have a problem when we look at the textile sector. We have a problem that we have more and more textiles, clothes being used in the European market, but also globally. But we know that the European consumption of textiles is really a driver for a growing sector, and we know that we consume more and more than ever before. And at the same time, the absurdity of it, and I bet we all can confess that it's also the case in our wardrobes, and we wear the clothes we are using less for a shorter time, and this is a problem that we also have to face. So the urgency that I also addressed in the initiative report is that as a EU, if we want to set a tone, we have to lead by example and ensure that textiles that are sold in our shops guarantee high environmental and social and human rights standards. So the responsibility, and this is, I think, a very urgent point, especially for us as S&D, is that we have to make sure that the responsibility for sustainable purchasing cannot be only left with the consumers. It has to be a job that all the actors that are also here together today in the room have to work together, because it's a systemic problem. We have to shift from the linear model to a circular model. And so far, we know that there has been a lot of collaboration between the different actors, but lawmakers haven't done enough. So the industry and the textile sector in general has been relatively untouched by legislation, and this is something that we need to address, that we have to change, because we want to ensure this level playing field for those who want to see a different business model striving. And as I told you, as rapporteur of the initiative and report, I demand, or I call for European legislation which guarantees that fashion is not produced at the cost of environmental destruction and human lives. Legislation that prevents that unsold clothes from being shredded or sent to landfill just because they are no longer in fashion or the warehouse is full. And I want legislation that enables to support a just transition in the whole sector, of course within Europe, but also beyond Europe's borders. And I am very happy that we will have all the knowledge here today. And I want to kickstart with the first part of the program, which is a short video message we are having from Commissioner Virginia Sinkevičius, who's leading on Commission side when it comes to the question of sustainable textiles. just a quick reminder, unfortunately, we don't have translation on this. It's in English, so I'm sorry for that. It's technical reasons. But Virginius has the floor now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me first of all wish you all a very happy and healthy new year. And thank you for organizing this important event and for your invitation. It is a new year, a new start, and a great time to make ambitious decisions like moving away from fast fashion. It's time for a major social movement, a major shift in people's thinking. In the Parliament, you are very close to Europe's citizens. That gives you a special role in encouraging Europeans to make a switch towards more sustainable clothing. We know you can help because you already did this very effectively for single-use plastics. Now it's time to do the same for sustainable textiles. It's nearly a year now since the Commission adopted the circular economy package, with the legislative proposal to make sustainable products the norm. It also included the first EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles. It's a strategy that gives stakeholders clarity and certainty about EU priorities. It also shows how textiles fit into our broader initiatives for the transition to a circular and digital Europe. The idea is to help the sector become more competitive and sustainable, with a lower impact on the environment. We do that by making textiles more durable and easier to repair, with more recycled content. We give consumers better information about the impacts of their purchases. Consumers themselves become a driving force in this transformation, pushing sustainability principles in all markets, including online. The ENVI Committee is now considering Ms. Burghardt's final report, and I would like to thank her and everybody else involved in this important work for their commitment and support. We will be looking very carefully at the new measures the Parliament will recommend. But if we want the textile strategy to be truly effective, we also need something else. We need to ensure an ambitious results for the eco-design for sustainable products regulation. With that regulation in place, our strategy will have stronger teeth. It will mean better information to consumers. And most important of all, it opens the way to secondary legislation and the targeted implementing acts we need to deliver change on the ground, specifically related to textiles. The clock is counting down, and we are counting on you to maintain the level of ambition and a speedy process of adoption. The Parliament is doing a great job with textiles. So please keep up the pressure. Keep on pushing for social and environmental fairness, not just in the Commission proposal, but with national governments as well. And keep up your vigilance on enforcement, on working conditions, and on imports and exports. Best wishes for your event today, and I look forward to meeting you soon in person again.
Well, thank you. If someone is listening from Commission, which I know because we have someone from the second floor in the second panel, say thank you to Virginius for his leadership on the topic, and we, of course, always are happy as Parliament to push him for more ambition. So that's really good, and we are happy also to talk with you on the elements he had been mentioning. With that, we are jumping to our first panel, which will deal with the question on how to move to sustainable production and use of textiles. I just wanted to quickly, before I present you this amazing panel that we are really happy to welcome here, just to tell you about how we will proceed, is that we will first have a round the table of all the people on the panel. And after this, we will have a Q&A session where we will have at least 2 rounds. We will look how much time we will have, but to, of course, also make sure that your questions can be asked. And the sad thing is, though, that we cannot take online questions. So this is a little bit sorry to say, but this is unfortunately the technical limitations we are having here right now. But this for the game. And I will start to present you the panel here. So on my left, I have the one with the, I think, longest travel today. From Copenhagen, joining us, Lars Fogh Mortensen, who is the head of sustainable consumption and production at the European Environmental Agency. We have on my other side, Mauro Scaglia, who is the Director of Sustainable Businesses of Eurotex, which is an official body representing European textile and apparel industry, which accounts for 153,000 companies, mostly SMEs, 1.3 million workers across the entire value chain, from fibers to finished products. Also very happy to welcome you here. Elspeth Hathaway, she is the Senior Policy Advisor responsible for the textiles, clothing, leather, and footwear sectors at Industrial Europe, which is, of course, the big trade union representing all the industrial and manufacturing workers across Europe, including those working in textiles. Very happy to also have you here representing the workers' side on it. And last but not least, we have Valeria Botta, who's the Head of Nature Protection and Restoration at ECOS, which is short standing for Environmental Coalition on Standards, which you of course know, which is an international NGO advocating for environmentally friendly technical standards, policies, and laws with 20 years of experience in this field. So very happy to also have, not you, but your organization. And good organizations always have a good after, like, telling people what they have learned from the past. So thanks so much for all of you joining us. For the Q&A sessions, I forgot, please speak slower than I tend to do, because this makes it easier for our amazing interpreters. I will try to do my best to also speak slower. We will start right away with the first introductory remarks of Lars, who will map us a little bit the scene on the topic, on the question of how we can approach sustainable production, and looking at the textile production model in general, but also on exports that we are doing as EU. I'm happy to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delara, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be back in the Parliament after COVID. So to discuss this is really, really important, but also to meet real people that I've only seen on screen for 3 years is a big deal for me. So I'm an expert on textiles and circular economy in the European Environment Agency, and I'm behind the work we've done in this area for the last 5 years. So basically, I will talk about textiles and environment in Europe's circular economy, just putting some numbers on the plate so that you're all aware of that. And in the next slide, I show my 3 points. First, I show growth in textiles production and consumption. Secondly, I tell you about the environmental impacts from textiles production and consumption, how high they are compared to other consumption areas. And third, I show you some early results from a briefing on EU exports on used textiles that we have not published yet, but I have the permission to show you today. So I'm quite excited about that. And in the next slide, that shows a picture of the volumes of textiles in the EU. So on average, we consume 14.8 kilograms per person of textiles. That includes 6 kilograms of total clothing, 6 kilograms of household textiles, and then 2.7 kilograms of shoes, which is not only based on textiles. Mauro reminded me yesterday. So these are really, really high numbers, which are growing, mostly in volume, not so much in money, because prices on textiles are actually falling compared to others. So on the next slide is my second point on the environmental impacts. And on this slide here, basically, this is a summary that is picked up by the European Commission in the strategy of the work we've done that shows that the European consumption of textiles has the 4th highest impacts on the environment and climate change on average, after food, housing, and mobility. And think about these other sectors and areas have been regulated for decades, and textiles has basically not. More specifically, it's one of the top 3 pressures on water and on land use, and it's one of the top 5 in terms of raw material use and greenhouse gas emissions. So really huge numbers that we see there. On the next slide, this is a picture from a report that we have coming out in a few weeks about bio-based textiles. We've tried to illustrate with traffic light symbols, red, yellow, orange, and green, what have the biggest impacts. And if you look at climate change, it is the fibers, it's the synthetic fibers, it's polyester and viscose who has the highest, same with toxicity. But then for other pressures on the environment, like water use, land use, and eutrophication, it's the cotton, it's the bio-based fibers that has the highest impacts. And the reason we show this is that it's not so easy just to shift from different fibers. It's about making all the fibers and all the products more sustainable. In the next slide, I show another issue, which is also high on your agenda, I understand, on the microplastics from textiles. So we did a report that we published last year on microplastics from textiles. So microplastics are basically from, as you can see from this picture on the left, is from sea-based resources, but most of it is from land-based resources. It's from litter, it's from coatings, turfs, tires, and so, but a lot is actually from wearing and washing of clothing. There's a lot of uncertainty about the numbers, but the best available numbers are that about 8% of European microplastics released to oceans are from synthetic textiles, and globally this figure is perhaps between 16 to 35%, so really huge numbers, but of course with a lot of uncertainty. In all likelihood, the numbers are probably even bigger than we see here. So that brings me to my last point here on the exports of used textiles. So on the next slide, basically, so we've looked into how much used textiles do we export. We don't call it textile waste deliberately because it's a mix of used textiles and waste. And what we have found is actually that from 2000 to 2019, the export of used textiles has tripled, from between 500 and 600 million tons to over 1,600 million tons in 2019. So these numbers are really huge. We export to basically from the EU countries to different hubs in the EU, some countries, and from there to basically to Africa and to Asia. In the past, it was mostly to African countries. Now it's more or less equal amounts to Africa and Asia. And the last slide here on the next one, this shows where our exports actually go. So as you can see here on the top, most goes to Pakistan. After that, United Arab Emirates, then Tunisia, a lot to Ukraine now, unfortunately, India, Ghana, Turkey, Cameroon, etc. But so we've looked into this a bit. Some of it is, of course, reused, but also a lot of it, we don't know what happens to it. It's landfilled. In Africa, it tends to stay in the country. In Asia, some of these, it is exported to Asian countries and from there on to other places, and we don't know what it happens. And I think this raises the question, actually, in the future, should we export our used textiles to undestined futures, or should we handle it ourselves? So that's a question we have to deal with. So that was a quick overview from my side. I hope it was clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lars. It was indeed quick, but very comprehensive, and showing us a little bit also about not only the urgency to act, but also the complexity. To come to you, Mauro, as we are knowing that there is the perspective also of the industry side to be shared on how far we are, of course, in leading on going to a sustainable production, but what are also the challenges and opportunities that are seen by the industry. So I would like to give you the word for the first round of your comments.
Vielen Dank. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is an opportunity for us to be here with you, so thanks for that. And I would like to really jump on the point on the panel, how do we make this move towards sustainable production and use? I think we can acknowledge, first of all, that this move is already happening. It's taking place for many years. We have evidence for that, but we need to take it to the next level. I think that's the main challenge, which brings us all together with the same goal, essentially. We believe, from our standpoint, that 3 ingredients are essential for that to happen, and the first one are particularly interconnected, and that is a strong sustainable industry, a strong demand for sustainable products. I'd like to start with these first 2 points, as they are naturally, inherently interconnected, the demand and offer, choosing and offering products. We believe we have a strong industry when we solve crises such as the energy crisis, for instance, that for some of our companies, this summertime not reopen after the summer break, simply because they could not afford to pay the energy bill. We have a strong industry when we have the skilled workforce that we need, when we reduce the burdens, when we reduce dependency from chemicals and raw materials, we import from outside the union territory, and when also we make legislation take into account the importance of these sectors for the competitiveness of our society and also the wealth we generate for our citizens. The sustainability of the industry, especially in Europe, I think it's very encouraging. We have clear indication. If you look at CO2 emission, for instance, and energy consumption, these have been decreasing steadily since 2008. We produce the same or more using less resource. That is efficiency, that is CO2 improvement. Quality and durability. It is what our companies basically make business with, because they stand, in addition to innovation and creativity, as the key factors for these sectors to compete. The repair service, we have a whole value chain engaged in workwear treatment and repairments. Think about hotel also linen products, how they are dealt with. Chemicals management, fundamental in part in any part of sustainability. We have a robust infrastructure of self-regulatory measures, and we have on top of that the probably strongest legislation in the world under which is even getting tougher. And we have very strong emission control, which is now being rediscussed also in this House. Recycling of textiles. This, I think, is one of the most promising and new and exciting also area of work where we are championing within Europe. There's a whole textile recycling value chain which has been built precisely also to answer the question Lars made, what do we do with actually 7.5 million tons of textile waste that we generate every year in the EU. There's a clear commitment from all the value chain, our value chain, but also recyclers, collectors, chemicals, fashion brands and retailers which support transition to circular textiles. The second point of the 3 ingredients I mentioned is fairly simple for us. It's a robust demand for sustainable textiles. We like to repeat to each other that there is a growing interest in sustainability in textile and garments, and it's true, and that's encouraging, but it's far too little if we talk about the old volumes. If you think about 28 billion of garments which circulate in the EU, including what we export, when consumers choose them, sustainability is not a main parameter. They don't choose based on sustainability, the average consumer. Price, aesthetic are the main parameters, and that's something we also need to change. And that's not only for consumers, it's the authority, the member states. They buy a lot of textile products and services through public procurement, and they don't ask for sustainability. They ask for value for money. You don't win a tender with sustainability outstanding performances. This is also hopefully going to change very soon. So clearly, sustainability is expensive. Investment in sustainability, it's a cost that the business need to pass over, and we need a bigger market for that, so that we can also, with scale economy, decrease the overall cost of sustainability and make it more affordable at large scale. Which takes me to my third and last point, which is good legislation. And I think we cannot not mention that in this House. I know it's going to be addressed better in the next panel. But something I want to mention, I've been 18 years in Euratex, so quite a long time. In 18 years, I have never seen this legislative agenda focusing directly or indirectly on textiles. We count 16 pieces of legislation and policy directly impacting on textiles or indirectly addressing it in a very fundamental way. It's huge. Across all the spectrum of legislation, we need to have enforceable legislation. Legislation the business can comply with, and the member states' authorities can actually check and control. If we don't do that, we have wishful thinking put on a legal text, which cannot be implemented in reality check. And I think that's a fundamental important point, because our members tell us we're okay with increasing the bar, we can improve it, but we need equal level playing field for everybody. Not only for our European industry to be more competitive, but also for everybody to play with the same rules. And I was, if I may, perhaps a bit surprised that we haven't really seen a call for more resources for the member states or market surveillance, for better market surveillance, so far in the report, but perhaps this is part of the discussion which is still taking place. And coming to the end of my points, same rules for all, global level playing field. We're gonna see historic change, we believe, with the ESPR legislation. Eco-design requirements, digital product passport, they're gonna change how this whole sector is performing. It's gonna be a new regulated sector, which, as Lars said, is not the case yet. And there's a potential, if it's properly done, to make a difference and take the worst quality product away from the market. Product environmental footprint and green claim legislation, if improved and properly done, can help informing consumers, because it's a shared responsibility, industry, consumers, and authorities. And we can continue with due diligence and other pieces of legislation. If properly done, they can deliver. My last point is that when we talk about textile, please mind, textile, it's a very diversified sector. Textile is not only garment, textile is much more than that. We have technical textiles, made and chosen based on performances. We have garments, we have home textiles. We need to think about the unintended consequences of legislation and what we really want to regulate and change. So, indeed, if we have good legislation, strong demand for sustainable products, and healthy industry sectors, we believe we can pretty much deliver anything we want to do. So I will stop here and happy to discuss further.
Thank you so much. I think this is a very hopeful call to say, and of course also thank you for highlighting the responsibility for us as Parliament to watch out that we have really also coherence in the different legislation that is going up. You mentioned the 16 ones that are directly or indirectly targeting the sector, and of course if we don't have coherence in the Parliament, then it's hard to make implementation, and then it's also hard for the industries to implement. So this is a really important call that we will have to follow. Moving to Elspeth, as we all know, is that the textile sector is a globally very distributed sector with a lot of people working in there, especially low-paid women, young women also. So I think this is a very also social question that we have to target when we talk about the transition that is going to happening in the process. And there I would like to have your thoughts on how the transition can be just and how a sustainable production will affect workers in the sector.
Can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful. You're all still awake. Good. Thank you so much for having us here today. So really important when we talk about a transition, a change in an industry, that we involve the workers. I think we can all agree on that. And I'm so happy, Dilara, that you've already said the words just transition. You said it at the start, so I'm happy because that's definitely what I'm going to talk about. So I'm here to represent the trade unions, to represent the workers in the sector. And we have some workers, our representatives online from across Europe as well. So apologies they can't ask questions, but they'll be listening and I'm sure we'll follow up with you. So today I'm going to try and cover 5 points in 5 minutes. Let's see if we can do that. And the first thing I want to do is to really stress the point that for trade unions, for workers, sustainability has to involve workers, so people, as well as the planet. And I think that is one of our major criticisms of the Commission's strategy, the communication, was that there was a lot of things there in terms of environmental changes, but it was a little bit lacking on the social. Of course, we welcome the ongoing work on due diligence and forced labour, which is wonderful. But there's many other things that we need to look at. We really need to look at investing in workers, how this move to more sustainable production, what it could mean in terms of working conditions, better wages, development of people. So the green and digital transition, what is the impact on the workers and how do we make it just is exactly what we want to speak about. And of course, looking at you, Dilara, as a representative of the S&D group, we're really hoping that you won't forget the social element when we talk about sustainability. So second thing I want to say is that we really hope, trade unions really hope that this move to a more sustainable sector could be good for workers. We really want to make this work for workers, both here and across the world. We really hope that this move away from fast fashion could be good for people who work in the industry. Because we have a really strong, proud history here in Europe, both in design and in production. And we really hope that continuing to focus on the best possible, highest quality products that are made in a green manner could lead to better working conditions, could lead to more pleasant working environments for workers. And it could also take some of the pressures off. Fast fashion is unfortunately known to have not the best purchasing practices. This puts a lot of pressure on small businesses. This puts a lot of pressure on workers, whether it be forced overtime, wage debt, huge amount of issues. So we really hope that we can take some pressure off costs, off delivery times, because this needs to end. The current practices that happen in some regions of the world really needs to end. So that's the second thing I want to say. The third thing I want to say, which Maura's already touched on, is this aspect of trying to level the global playing field. So we know in this sector there's tough global competition, and it's a big issue because what it does is it puts downward pressure on wages, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to do. So we really hope that the strategy and looking at having all products on the EU market being sustainable could actually help raise standards across the globe. And we really think that's what the EU and MEPs have a responsibility to do morally, to try and raise the environmental and social standards across the globe. So that's what we think needs to be done. But there's still some things missing if we look at international trade, whether it's the ongoing review just now on GSP or the ongoing work on the TSD. We really want to use European trade to improve the standards in various countries. And also, again, to look at purchasing practices. We were a little bit disappointed, Dilara, if I'm honest, that INTA didn't have an opinion on your report. And I can see some INTA advisors in the room. So I'm going to put it out there that I think in terms of international trade, absolutely vital, looking at the global sector. And it'd be really good if some parliamentarians in INTA could look at having an ownership report looking at how do we have fair and sustainable international trade in the garment sector. Fourth thing I'd like to say is that this transition, this green and digital transition, won't happen overnight and it won't happen by itself. So we do really need to work together. We need investment, whether that's in technology, whether it's in equipment, but also in people. We need access to clean, green energy. That's a challenge in itself. We know that there's a shortage of workers in Europe. We need to make the sector more attractive. We need to make sure that people have good conditions, good pay. But we also need to reskill and upskill workers to make sure none of them are left behind in this transition. That's really important. And again, as already has been mentioned, we need to look at demand, because we need to make sure that the demand is there, whether it's from consumers, whether it's from public procurement. We need to look at how we make sure there's demand there. And the last thing I wanted to mention was just transition. So a lot of you will know the term just transition. It's a trade union concept, and it basically means whether there's a transition, be it green, digital, that no worker or region is left behind. That's really, really important. And for us, there's a lot of things that this will mean. It really means involving social partners, so your workers and your employers, in quality social dialogue. It means anticipating the future. What will the sector look like in a year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? How do we anticipate change and prepare for the future? That's absolutely vital. We need to ensure job-to-job transitions. And if, for example, this means someone moving from production into the circular economy, that's absolutely fine, but we need to make sure that these are also quality jobs in the circular economy. And we also need to remember, when we talk about just transition, that we are often talking about in this sector, as Dilara said, some more vulnerable groups, whether it's female workers, people who are lower paid workers, or sometimes those who are self-employed or home-based workers. So we really need to give some special attention. It's a different sector to some of the larger sectors, for example, steel or automotive. We need to do a bit more planning. So in conclusion, we're going into this being positive. We really hope that this transition to a more sustainable sector will be good for workers, but it needs to be managed in a socially responsible way. And that means quality social dialogue, engagement with the workforce, but also support at regional, national and European level. And I'll leave it there because I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much on highlighting especially the just transition aspects, which I agree are very much lacking yet in the Commission's proposal, but I can assure you that at least the rapporteur of the report is eager to close these loops, and I hope that we will have the majorities to do so. Last but not least, we go to you, Valeria, to tell us from the civil society perspective how we can close the loopholes when it comes to circularity.
Yes. So first of all, thank you again for having us here. It's so good to meet everybody in person. And we know that the textile industry needs to change. Indeed, the 16 pieces of legislation or an initiative on the table, it's a testament of how unregulated this sector was. So the industry is on the tipping point of very deep, meaningful change if we are indeed to move towards a transition towards circularity and towards a sustainable future. As you all know, we reach Earth Overshoot Day earlier and earlier every year. So it's the capacity of the planet to actually keep it up with what we ask out of the planet. And it's coming in July, so 6 months in. So clearly there is a lot of planetary boundaries that we're overstepping, be that climate change, which is the one that we often talk about, but also biodiversity, novel entities, so chemical pollution, quite a lot of different fields that need a clear answer from binding regulation, and especially targeting different sectors, as Lars has showcased, that are quite key on climate change and a lot of other indicators that he presented. So from our side, how to move this towards more circularity is that, of course, 2020 was a key year because we have seen the textile strategy with a clear vision for the future, with a very promising ideas put forward in the report and that is coming up from the Parliament, as well as, of course, the ESPR, so the Eco-Design for Sustainable Product Regulation, which is a regulation that has really a lot of room to be extremely impactful to change the entire sector, provided that the environmental gains that are made through increased circularity, increased durability, increased repairability and reuse are not met with an ever-growing production of textile and textile products. And this is just skyrocketing, is going faster and faster. We see the numbers. So, of course, when you look into how to deal with a more sustainable textile sector, you start with the basis. So, of course, you start with the design, you start with the material, so responsibly sourced, but also which kind of materials. And I agree there, all different fibers have different hotspots, clearly. Over 60% of the fiber market is made out of synthetic fiber. So that is also something that needs to be weighted in when discussing all of the different hotspots that different fiber have, but also the processing and the manufacturing aspect when producing textile is where most of the environmental hotspot happen, as well as the social hotspot happen as well. So the SPR has quite a lot of room to improve there. The situation, for me, another key aspect is the ban of the destruction of unsold goods. So when we move into circularity, we cannot forget that we produce things with a lot of labor and material use that go into these products, and they cannot be just discarded and scrapped, as you were saying at the beginning. I think that the European Union has a clear role to play here, to lead by example. It's what you said in the beginning. There is level playing field that has been used quite a lot, and of course, so raising the bar on social and environmental aspects and chapters in trade agreement is also extremely helpful, not to disregard the fact that there is a lot of production that actually takes place still within the European Union, where we can do really quite a lot of things, because we always talk about clothes when talking about the textile sector, but indeed it's upholstery, it's floor covering, it's technical textile, it's textile for protective equipment, and the more sustainable one, all of them are the ones that are not produced. So, of course, the rule of thumb of moving towards a more sustainable textile sector is to use what you have for longer, first and foremost. And then I just wanted to talk about market surveillance, because indeed, when we move towards setting up requirements, minimum requirements on specific characteristic for textile, that would take the worst product out of the market, out of the European market. We cannot forget that there needs to be market surveillance that are equipped to check that those are actually met. So, and that the burden to check all of this. And of course, I have in mind chemical and chemical in products, because there has been a lot of report lately on the fact that there is a lot of toxic substances that remain on products that are on the European Union market. Yeah, and I think I'll leave it at that. Overall, we need to close the circle within the circular economy, but first and foremost, slow it down, and we need a material reduction footprint target that would take us there. So if we are to make sustainable products, when it comes to sustainability, it is environmental and social at the same time. So we're very happy that for the moment within the SPR report in ENVI, there is quite a lot of mention of the social aspect, which we very much welcome, because the two things need to go hand in hand, because there shouldn't be any trade-off between the two. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valeria. I think it's also some aspects that you have pointed out that we also have to look at targets that we already set, for example, when it comes to the recycling of textiles that will be there 2025. How will we reach them? What is, I think, also a good question that we can take to the next panel, maybe asking also Commission on how we go forward with that. But I think what we just had was an amazing summary of the most present issues from different perspectives, and I really thank you that you have been so pointy and clear, because this gives us the possibility now to have a full 30 minutes of Q&A, which is, I think, really good. And I would then ask you to take the floor. If you take the floor, please say your name, your organization, and then ask your question. Thank you.
Oui, bonjour. Hello, I am a pharmacist. I'm from the European Physical Society, and I have 3 small questions. The first, recyclable clothes. I try to wear recyclable clothing myself, and I wouldn't have thought there's a difference between importing a normal piece of clothing and a recyclable one. And perhaps also, is there a possibility to make recyclable clothes cheaper than normal clothes, because in that way we can educate people so they would have an interest in the recyclable nature of clothes, and that might well be a solution to some of the problems we're facing. Second question, traceability. Traceability for clothes is limited so far. I always look at what is the percentage of synthetic and natural fibers when I buy an item of clothing. So it's important to look at criteria and the chemical substances that are being used to produce a specific garment. It's very important. And in what quantity? A lot of people are allergic to chemical products, and they don't know what products are in the clothes they're wearing. Final question. Digital passports for products, what are they, and how can we try and examine this issue? It's extremely interesting, because if you buy into a particular line, then a digital passport could be a very useful thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Then in the red shirt.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this event. This is Blanca Morales. I am from the European Consumer Organization, and I wanted to ask the question with respect to the demand of, or the need for consumers to demand sustainable products, as I understand from the statements that there is not enough demand, and this is a barrier for the industry to make more sustainable products. So the question is, how are you reflecting on this issue, and whether it's only about making more sustainable the items? Isn't it also about perhaps reducing the amount of products that are offered? Because we also see that there are more number of collections on the shop, that we have seasons, and this topic I haven't seen really mentioned so much in the panel, and I think that this is the core of the problem, because we can have 50 T-shirts in our wardrobe that are all very sustainable and produced in very good conditions, but is this going to be the solution? So how do we reflect in reducing the number, or incentivizing second-hand market, repair, other kind of business models? And then the question with respect to the kind of studies that are done or used to make the statements that there is no demand for sustainable products. There are also surveys from consumer organizations. As an example, I wanted to mention the German consumer organization, ZBV. They presented a report in November last year, where they were showing that there is demand for sustainable products by consumers. So 94% of the consumers would like their clothes to be done in such a way that they will last longer. They would be willing to wear clothes longer in order to protect the climate, 75%. And also a majority said that they were willing to pay more for a T-shirt if they would know that they would last longer as well. There is also interest in second-hand markets. So we have some good feel. I totally agree. We need to do more awareness raising on the topic, but we have enough evidence to say it's a matter. It's not a matter just of consumer choice. It's a matter of legislation as well that we need. So this is my question, to perhaps go a little bit more in reflecting in the issues of demand, and whether this is sustainable fashion, whether it is just really a matter of consumer choice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I take one more, and then I will give back to the panel.
Thank you very much. Ben van Peperstraat. I'm with the Fair Trade Advocacy Office. Maybe a comment and a question, a small comment. Because in the beginning you said indeed, you framed that governing the textile sector is really everybody on board. MSIs, consumers, brands, etc. Maybe to add one layer to that is, of course, also citizens, because there's currently a European Citizens Initiative ongoing to seek living wages in the garment sector. So that's maybe an additional layer, and adds to Mauro's list of potential legislation in the pipeline. Which is very interesting, because this is really citizens trying to step up and propose legislation to make sure that garment workers who make our clothes also get the wages that they earn. So they want to do that with transparency, due diligence, but also unfair trading practices. They want to curb those. And I think that leads me to my question, because Elspeth, you already mentioned that. So maybe you could elaborate a bit on thinking, on your thinking, what kind of unfair trading practices, how does that need to be dealt with within the textile strategy? And maybe linked to that, a question for Mauro, because each time we talk about environmental concerns, for example, too much water usage, or social concerns like wages need to go up, occupational health and safety, etc., it's always the manufacturer who needs to do this. But the ILO also clearly says that the manufacturing base itself, whether it's in Europe or beyond, is often under pressure by the brands and retailers who buy from those facilities and who have much more market power. And so we saw also in the COVID crisis that quite a lot of these manufacturers not only have higher expectations in terms of due diligence, social, environmental concerns, but at the same time don't necessarily have reliable business partners with brands and retailers just canceling contracts, the extending payment terms, etc. And that may lead to your point of enforcement, or at least that's my question to you, whether or not you could expand a bit on that enforcement, because normally if you enforce a contract in court, then from a manufacturing perspective, if your counterparty is so much more powerful, especially in the garment sector, it might actually lead you, it might be the quickest way to no longer having future orders. So maybe we should think about other forms of enforcement other than just civil enforcement, and maybe you have some thinking about that and could expand on that as well. Thanks.
Thank you. I think all three questions really also added good on further discussions that we should go for. It looks like we have planned this, which we don't have. Maybe, Valerie, do you want to kick off? Yeah.
Sure. Do you want us to go in order or to pick and choose?
Pick and choose the ones where you think your perspective is much most needed, somewhere targeted. So just
okay.
decide.
So overall, indeed, I mean the decrease of production. So there is an overproduction. There is an overproduction for a lot of different reasons. There is a pricing element to it. There is the fact that environmental and social externalities are not factored in those, because indeed there are externalities and left for communities to deal with. So when it comes to making sustainable products the norm, it should not come to consumer to ask for it. It should be the norm that they shouldn't even be questioning whether something is sustainable or not. The European Union should lead the way and have sustainable products on the market. And when it comes to that, of course, what I was referring to with the material footprint target, material use footprint target, is that when we look into how much the Earth overshoot, how much resource we are using, too much and too many. So how do we bring it back and to a living and operating place for our planet so that it can fulfill everybody's needs? And then so it's not really up to consumer, but it's really up to producer to kind of understand that a sustainable business in the long run is a business that takes into consideration all those things and leads the way, because otherwise the linear model of this industry cannot stand. It's one planet that we have, and we all need to be clothed, yes, have water that we all drink, food. So there is quite a lot of capacity that this planet needs to provide to us. And setting some targets and setting some boundaries of what this could be achieved with some clear indicators and some speed, I would say, timeline to get there. Then, of course, we need to incentivize the repair sector. There is quite a lot of discussion about reducing VAT rates, so how to make circular business model much more accessible. Because sometimes the costs of repairing something or bringing it to a repair, given the price of some fast fashion items out there, don't make the weight. So clearly it's with the legislation. Clearly green public procurement can be used on a lot of things as a levy for circularity and for sustainable product to kind of bridge some barriers and market barriers at entry point. That can be then spread out for everybody, provided that still we slow this circle down. And then for everything that is regarding the traceability, traceability is a huge issue. I mean, we come from different background possibly. I mean, the food sector, the traceability of the different ingredient that you put on some of the product needs to be bulletproof. So it is something that the textile industry has not looked into so much, because there are indeed, and it's complex, it's a very complex issue, but that needs to be tackled so that indeed you would have a traceability and transparency on the materials that you use, on the chemicals that are used within the production processes that stay with the product, and all of this is to be discussed within the digital product passport, which is a spill-off from the eco-design for sustainable product regulation, where we call for a no data, no market access. So if you don't have those data, the product should not be on the market. You should know these things again, because this is the responsibility of an industry that has understood that there are some challenges ahead, and that this needs to be faced for the future and for a resilient and sustainable textile. And I think I'll stick at it.
Thank you. Mauro goes next.
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, a couple of points also, some asked directly. In reverse order, the pressure of the manufacturers. Yes, manufacturers are definitely under pressure, that's clear, for a number of directions, from their supply side, from their purchasing, from the client side. There are all sorts of different pressure they're exposed to. And we're saying there are widespread initiatives for responsible business practices that we have seen globally taking place, and we often hear also at the OECD forum level how this progress and deliver, and I think this is very interesting to see in the global part of regions of the world how this deliver. One of the pressure also comes often by the fact that manufacturers have very much different requirements of information, audit pressure from different sides. And I think harmonization in that sense is one of the best ways on how to harmonize the pressure and simplify, the pressure that their manufacturing side is subject to. When I was talking about enforcement, I was not specifically talking about enforcement like in court, but rather enforcement of legislation. How we make sure that, as I mentioned before, if you think about in Europe, we import 80% of what we consume in terms of garments, 23 billion of products, a few years ago data. We don't have a system to control that this product, they all comply, or a sizable majority comply with the chemical regulation, for instance. So we keep making legislations, but we don't check if that legislation is enforced. So that is a fundamental issue that we must address before we go into eco-design requirements. Otherwise, we make requirements, but we don't check if people can actually comply. And we know there are free riders, for sure. That's clear. Thank you, Blanca, for reminding of different studies. There are different studies showing the indication of consumers, the propension to purchase certain items. We see different studies saying different things. We see in reality, is a sort of reality check, that a more sustainable product does not necessarily sell better than a non-sustainable product. So that's the point I wanted to make. There's a really clear reality check. I mean, if you go on the ground and you see where are the biggest SKUs and what are the dimensions of the products sold, the volumes actually, you can clearly see an objective reality on that. We should make more product more sustainable. That's basically what we hope also the eco-design regulation can help us with. And last point, I like very much the question on why don't we make recyclable garments less expensive? That's a very interesting point. And we think it should not be only the recyclable garments that should be less expensive, but the more sustainable garment should all be less expensive. There are different ways we can work on that. At legislative level, it's actually competence of the member states to reflect on maybe eco-modulation system when they will develop a tax which will be applied to cover the cost of the collection for separate collection of textiles. It's called EPR in the jargon. So that could be something in the power of member states. Perhaps there are ideas on eco-modulation fee, so-called. But at the large scale, we think its scale economy can help. If you make more and more products more sustainable, you bring down the cost for that. If there is a broader choice from consumers and authorities, this will become affordable for much larger market share. I think that could be also a point to consider. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Then we go to Elspeth.
No problem. Delara, I think I'm going to stick to Ben's question. So thank you, Ben. It was nice to see you and Marta here from Fair Trade Advocacy Office. And thank you for raising the ECI, so the European Citizens Initiative. I'm looking at Delphine, who's here from Fashion Revolution. You might explain a bit more about this later. But of course, action on living wages is absolutely vital. There's a lot of people in the room today, and I hope everyone, before you leave, you sign up to this European Citizens Initiative. Absolutely vital that we look at wages throughout the supply chain. With regards to unfair trading practices, what we're looking at here is the business-to-business relationships. And it's quite interesting in the textile sector because there's such a big difference. You have these huge brands, but a lot of the companies are SMEs. They're really small, so you have this really big power imbalance. And we've seen issues when it comes to orders being cancelled or postponed or changed at the last minute. And I know that during COVID, I was working with Ben in the Fair Trade Advocacy Office looking at what had happened, and it was really, really dreadful. And who loses? It's always the workers that end up losing out. We know that there are some enterprises, some SMEs that are still agreeing to produce things under cost just because they're so worried about losing orders. And one of the issues is that some businesses, they don't see wages as a fixed cost, and that's why workers get squeezed, which is really, really unfair. Order changes can lead to forced overtime, with workers too scared to say no. It can lead to more issues when it comes to occupational health and safety. So we really want this to change. Concretely, what we're asking for is an EU directive. We already have one for agri-food, which has received some positive feedback. And we think garments, we know that this is a bigger challenge in this sector. Why can't we have the same thing? I know that the Fair Trade Advocacy Office are working on some new reports, so please feel free to share those when they come out. And I also think that INTA will have a hearing on this topic on unfair trading practices in the textile sector on the 23rd of January. So anyone here who's interested, come along to that because I think that'll also be interesting. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I just forgot to mention that later also there will be the opportunity to make a solidarity picture for the initiative we were talking about. So we printed them out. If you want to do so, you can do. Last but not least, Lars, I would give you the word, maybe asking you to definitely hit also on the question of traceability, which I think was not yet, but of course then also pick and choose what you want to add up.
Thanks very much. Answering to these questions, I would like to do that by putting some knowledge on the table, I think. Basically, what we see, the trends are that volumes of textiles are increasing. So more and more, it's getting cheaper compared to other goods. This is what we're looking at. This is what we are finding. And basically, this is because textiles are made of increasingly synthetic textiles, which are made of plastics, which is made of oil, which is cheap. And this is the tendency we see. And I think if politicians want to change this and the impacts of that, there are certain things you can look at. And one thing would be to have higher quality, to have things that can last longer, through measures like eco-design and others, to have better design, to have design that mixes less fibers that are with the same fibers, you would have less impacts, longer use, to do something to reduce the waste within it. The unsold textiles, the returned textiles, the waste within the consumers, all of that to address that, and less greenwashing. We see greenwashing all over the place in this industry. So there's a lot of issues to tackle, and I think looking at the strategy, there's a lot of things put on the table there. Looking at your report, that strengthens some of these things. So from a knowledge perspective, it looks like this can change these things. So that's really good. Of course, some things could be more reinforced. In terms of traceability, I think it could be one issue could be to put in place some kind of like monitoring framework or something related to this. How do you monitor whether we're actually making progress on this? Implementing the strategy, having all these things. As Marco mentioned, this is 16 pieces of legislation being put in place, basically touching upon different issues at the same time. And we have to, I think there should be something in place to kind of monitor and looking at that and whether we are going in the right direction. And the right direction is, if politicians want to do so, of course, to reduce environmental impacts, climate impacts, and the negative social impacts at the same time. So I think that's the challenge. But yeah, thanks a lot.
Definitely, and also that we know that it's not only the direct textile sector that is part of the discussion, but also the whole supply chain, which makes it even complex. Also speaking as a lawmaker, where we, of course, also have different industries coming, different influences, or not only, of course, industries, but, different actors from different parts of the supply chain coming and also putting forward their ideas. So it makes it really complex to guarantee this coherence. And this is the complex challenge we want to tackle here as European Union. And we are very ambitious about this. But of course, this also has to be coherent, coming back to that point. So we have 6 minutes left for this round. I thought so. Maybe some questions we can also take into the next round. So bear with me that I have to pick 2 now. And then we will go. Oh, I'm sorry, but we have another round. You.
Hello, okay, you can hear me. My name is Lana Takvorian, and I'm here on behalf of TOMRA, which is the leading European provider for sorting and collection technologies for the recycling and reuse of waste. You may know us from the deposit return machines where you can bring back used beverage bottles in exchange for a small deposit. So more to the point at hand today, we have also developed the first fully automated textile sorting plant in Malmö, which can sort 24,000 tons of textile waste per year with a high degree of efficiency and precision, and thus provide high-quality materials for fiber-to-fiber recycling. I want to thank you, MEP Burkhardt, for your ambitious first draft report, which places strong emphasis on prevention and reuse. However, and although we fully understand that this draft was limited in length, which might have led to some elements being overlooked, I wanted to take this opportunity to underline that recycling of post-consumer textiles is also a key element of circularity that needs to be addressed. By our estimates, approximately 7 million tons of textiles are discarded in the EU every year, and it is thus crucial that we develop the sorting and recycling infrastructure necessary to ensure these materials can feed back into the loop, especially if we are to develop ambitious eco-design requirements for new textile products. Thank you.
Thank you. So the shorter the question, the more we can take. Just say. You.
Thank you. I'm Marie-Jeanne Gartner, working for Reuse, the international network of social enterprises active in repair and reuse. I also would like to bring a comment more than a question and jump on a very good point that was raised by Elspeth about sustainability that is not just about environment but also workers, and I think that's exactly what social enterprises do by preventing the generation of waste and at the same time providing opportunities for people in terms of job opportunities and upskilling, reskilling opportunities. And that leads me to my point, which is I think that the Textile INI and the report of the European Parliament is a very big opportunity to make strong support for the reuse sector and especially call on the Commission to implement separate targets for preparation for reuse, and recycling. And we have already examples from member states that are already implementing it that is possible. So my point is to make sure that it's something that is included into the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Next. Now that everyone is getting shy, then you. And behind you, sorry. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Katia Dejan-Vladimírova. I'm from the University of Geneva. I'm a senior researcher, and I also represent the International Research Network on Sustainable Fashion Consumption. So I'm the voice of the researchers, let's say, in this conversation. Thank you. I applaud really the efforts done with the EU textile strategy and with your intervention, with the opinion that you're doing now. There are several points that I would like to raise, but right now, just for the purpose of time, I will focus on the main one, which is about planetary boundaries and limits. And I'm piggybacking on what Valeria already brought up. It's about the last sentence of your explanatory note, which says that none of this is going to be meaningful if we do not address if we don't reduce the use of natural resources in the process. So we are missing right now the specific targets, the specific caps, and I would like to draw your attention to a report that came out in November, which I co-authored with researchers. It's a research report done by Hoderkohl Institute in Berlin, which has actually calculated what those fair share distribution could look like, would be if we are to address and to stay within the 1.5 degree climate change target of the Paris Agreement. And I would like to just note that this upper target per capita emissions is about 129 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, and the richest 20% in Germany, for example, consume more than 500 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So we have data on what would be this maximum, volumes that we need to cap. We also have data on how unequally these consumption emissions are distributed. So I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that this data is out there. It's welcome to be used in the report to as a next follow-up to the resource reduction targets.
Thank you so much. I think this was more a round of giving policy advices for me, how what kind of amendments we should draft for the vote for the deadline next week. But I still, of course, want to give you one opportunity for final words until we to the next panel. So, Elspeth.
No. Very quickly, in terms of looking at the circular economy, 100% support the various green jobs that we could have. But as I said, green jobs need to be good jobs, good contracts, proper health and safety training as well. But no, Dilara, I was just to say thank you. And again, just to stress that this could be a really good opportunity for workers, this move to sustainability. But sustainability needs to be good for people and the planet, and that it needs to be managed in a socially responsible way. Thanks.
On our side, I think I just want to mention the export of the used textiles again, because I think that's we haven't even published this yet. The data is not out there, so it's not fully addressed yet, and that might be important to consider, I would say. And then also actually looking into the waste amounts in the system, what happens to the unsold and returned textiles, and we're going to look into that next year. But of course, now the policy is happening right now. So this is something you may want to consider.
Thank you. Maybe picking up on the last comments, I think definitely we need reuse and recycling. This is absolutely a must to deal with the limitary planet boundaries that we have. As we did already before with the couple from energy and production, we can do the same with footprint of materials. On recycle, we have an initiative, Rehabs. We look for 2.5 million tons waste-to-waste recycled by 2030. I think we're going to work a lot with that. And final words, I think Europe has a very strong industry which believes in sustainability. We are an asset to make this delivered, and let's work together on this.
Yes, I mean, let's work together on this. There is so much that the European Union can set the bar and showcase how things can be done, and be the golden standard when it comes to textile and to drive the textile transformation that is very much overdue. So let's all work together and put our brains together to make that happen in indeed a fair and sustainable way for everybody.
Thank you so much for this first amazing panel. And you're not a very clappy audience, but we can maybe just give a clap. Thank you. And then I would propose that we change panels now, and then we continue. Okay, quick reminder that we will have, okay.
It's nice to use that.
Yes, we will start with the next panel now. Just a quick reminder that we will have the opportunity to chat later, but we don't have so much time left for the debates, and this is why we came here too, so let's go on with that. I would start, as you might see in the program, the topic of the next panel will go into the nitty-gritty details of how to regulate textiles in question of eco-design, but of course also beyond. And as you know from the first round, I will firstly present you the speakers, then we have a tour de table, and then we will have your questions again. First, I want to introduce Matthias, my guy, who's the coordinator of Sustainable Product Initiative in the Commission, the DG Envy, who will give us then also an overview on what is actually planned right now in the pipeline. We have my dear colleague Alessandra Moretti from S&D, who is the rapporteur of the Eco-Design Requirements for Sustainable Product, SPI, as we all know it. Then we have Bente Bauer with us, who's the Public Affairs Director at the Policy Hub, Circularity for Apparel Footwear, which unites more than 700 brands, retailers, and manufacturers across the globe, and represents more than 50% of the global sector. So a very important perspective to have when we talk about the legislation and the implementability. Then we have Julia Blaise, who's from the Policy Director of EURIC, the European Recycling Industry Confederation, where you focus on regulatory policy as well as legal issues and the importance of recycling industry. Also important when we talk about the circularity question, because it's not a hen-egg situation we're talking about. And last but not least, we have Emily McIntosh, who's the policy officer for textiles at the European Environmental Bureau, where you have been working since 2015 in various roles and very intensively on the sustainability of textiles. Thank you all for being here. And we will start with you, Matthias, giving us a little bit the mapping of what is in the pipeline. We heard 16 files right now are directly or indirectly connected to the textile sector. And beyond, you, of course, also have the Ambition as Commission that is really supported by the Parliament to make the whole European economy circular, which is, of course, a very big goal. And then, again, also then merges a very complex approach and a lot of files, hence the 16 files we're talking about. So can you tell us what exactly the Commission wants to achieve with the legislation? And one question we are definitely also all very interested in is, do you have any news on the green claims?
Yeah, good afternoon first to everybody and also people online, and thanks a lot to both of you for organizing this. I'm very impressed, I guess, as most of you. It's not just post-COVID, but it's really a packed big room in the Parliament, plus a lot of people online. So that's really welcome, because also what we are discussing is rather important. So first I'll do a personal thing, which is the jacket I'm wearing I bought in 2008. I hope it doesn't show too much, but obviously I'm not the fast fashion person, so that makes me at least personally qualified not to be discredited to speak about what we're talking today. What I'd like to do, I work in DG Environment, but I also coordinate the work of 3 Directorate Generals who are working on Sustainable Products Initiative, which is Environment, DG Grow, and DG Ener. And I'm mentioning this because I think it shows that also the Commission, like Parliament, and like many of you who commented, really sees what we're doing is the need for systemic change. It's not just the initiative of one policy area or another, but it requires the, if you want, the one government approach and the one society approach. Second thing I wanted to mention is I will focus a little bit more on the ESPR, so the regulation on sustainable products, because the main reason for that is many of you have mentioned it will be one of the main legislative instruments that we hopefully, if co-legislators proceed as it looks like they are, will have available rather soon. I will mention some of the other things we're doing, just roughly where we are, and then I'll try to limit it to that and then answer more in the questions. So what are we trying to achieve? Several of you mentioned planetary boundaries today. And then others, like Mauro, were talking about the industry. The colleague from the unions was talking about the need to have the transition that we're doing socially just. So we were actually looking at all these elements when we were looking at the Sustainable Products Initiative. Our starting point was that we need tools based on eco-design, which already works. We have 17 years of experience on something that works largely on energy efficiency, but also on some other aspects. And we thought we need to build on this base to create another useful, powerful regulatory tool that can support the, if I can call it, the circular economy half of the Green Deal. It's a very simplistic way of putting it, but we have a well-established field of measures in the area of climate. We have a strong key in the area of environment, and we felt that eco-design could be a tool that really brings a very strong additional power to what we're doing here. We had in mind not just the environmental improvements, because we figured out that the way eco-design works, it actually does support the front runners. It basically does support the businesses that want to engage in producing more sustainably and producing more sustainable products. We realize this is not enough. So what we see in your reports and what we see in comments, I just want to acknowledge that's why we also have the strategy. We don't think one regulatory measure can deliver all. It's just a piece in arsenal, but we think it can be very powerful because regulation does work. And I'll come back to what Mauro said. We also hear it from the businesses. They prefer to have a clear regulatory framework in which you have level playing field, in which everybody, no matter where they produce, has to meet the same requirements. And this, in fact, will deliver more environmental impacts than if we would let the situation go on as it does. We have some very ambitious countries in Europe that want to introduce measures. We actually support that. But that misses out on delivering on the potential of the single market. We have nearly 500 million people who are who can represent a powerful tool for promoting sustainable production. We realize this does not address in itself the question of whether are we producing too much or not, but with the measures that we foresee, we actually see reductions are possible and actually quite substantial ones. Because if we make things last longer, if we make sure that things are not produced in a way that's damaging to the immediate environment, or that these negative impacts arise during their use or disposal, we can actually achieve a lot of what we have to meet both our climate targets and to accelerate the transition to the circular economy. So I think this is the main purpose of why the proposal on the ESPR was made. I will not give you a whole presentation that would bore you to death, but I think the most important elements here are that we have an instrument that worked rather well. Some people would argue we needed to do more and faster, but still they would agree it worked rather well in delivering substantial energy efficiency gains for the consumers and for the economy by extension, which by addressing a number of smaller groups of products, our cumulative results were pretty big. So the example we give these days is that estimated savings from existing eco-design measures in terms of energy, million tons equivalent in 2021 were 109 million tons equivalent, which is more than energy consumption of Poland. So this is something that you can check. It can be traced in eco-design environmental impact accounting. But this is the type of scale that we achieved in energy efficiency that I think we are looking across some or many other environmental fields. So that is something that we plan to do after the framework regulation would be adopted by co-legislators. The Commission would present, let's call it the first generation of so-called delegated acts, which will be addressing a number of products that go beyond energy-related products. And I'll come to the bit that's probably most interesting for many of you who've been following this closely. While we are engaged in the process with the co-legislators, we already promised at the time of adoption that the Commission would inform the wider general public and the co-legislators of what we preliminarily consider are the candidates for the products that go beyond what we have now that should be regulated. So as it stands now, I think by the end of this month, the Commission will publish a consultation in which we will identify which products these are, why do we think they should be included. So we look at their environmental impact, we look at things like improvement potential, and we look at candidate measures that could be taken. So we're not precluding anything, but we're just showing a little bit more clearly what the Commission proposes we could do with this framework. And we also hope this will help the Parliament and the Council to have a better idea on what you're adopting. So I think this, I would stop here because I know I'm going to get very targeted questions later on the ESPR. But I would also mention that, of course, I will not name the 16. I'm not even sure I can name the 16 measures you're referring to. But I want to mention three things because I picked them up from the first panel. One is this measure applies to all products that are placed on the market in Europe. So it is applying to wherever you produce your product, the product has to comply with the rules we put in place. This will create a level playing field, and this, in our view, will be encouraging the race to the top, if you want. It's not a protectionist measure, it's a measure based on environmental impacts, but it should instigate the race to the top, because basically everybody who wants to sell on a, although mature but very wealthy market in European Union will have to be able to comply with these measures. And we already saw a lot of positive impacts now. We have countries from Turkey to countries in South America and even China up to a point. Aside from complying with our rules when they sell to us, they're introducing similar schemes to what we have in eco-design or energy labeling in their countries. So that's my first point. Second one is the context of social, which is very important. It is very important for the Commission, and we were exploring whether we can include directly requirements on social in the ESPR itself. Our conclusion at the time was that because the nature of those requirements will be quite different to what we already have in existing environmental standards and can use almost immediately. First thing. Second thing, because we do have the proposal on due diligence, which should be dealing with the whole responsibility of the company, so not the product, but the whole company. So if company engages in production sites, it has to respect certain rules. If we had applied this just to the products, we could have an absurd situation where you have to establish a due diligence for one product, but your 80% of your other operations are not covered. So for that reason, the due diligence was seen as a more suitable instrument. And then finally, it's not ESP related, but because I think you made some legitimate points on just transition, on green skills. These all are the things that are priority for the Union, not just for the Commission. We do have Just Transition Fund, we have the platform, we have programs on green skills. So again, I'm not arguing this should not be discussed in this context, quite the contrary, but I'm just trying to bring the context that we are collectively working on these aspects of transformation of Europe's economy into a more sustainable one. And then finally, so of the other measures, there is a revision of the textiles regulation going on, which will focus largely on how to display the sustainability information, and we're discussing with colleagues how to best make these things match. On green claims, I'm afraid I don't have definitive news for you. What I can say is that it was clear that we do have a problem with greenwashing. The analysis shows that we should do something, and it's part and parcel of what I was saying before about level playing field. We are looking very carefully at what additional can be done to the things we are already doing with the consumer protection rules. And colleagues who are working on this informed me before this meeting that we should have clear news on what's going to happen pretty soon, but I cannot give you more than that today. And I've already spoken a bit longer than I planned to, so I'll shut up now.
Thank you, and I bet you will get a lot of questions afterwards too. We will continue with Alessandra. You are the rapporteur of the SPI, and I wanted to ask you if you can elaborate a little bit on how the eco-design regulation can contribute to move to a more sustainable production of and use of textiles.
Thank you, Delara, for this important opportunity to create a dialogue and an exchange of views between us about the future of our planet. And it's a pleasure for me to see many young people here and many young girls. So I'm really proud that this topic is in your intention. So moving towards a more sustainable production and use of textiles is of paramount importance, and it's really urgent. We should ensure that textile products placed on the EU market are long-lived, reusable and recyclable, and free of toxic and dangerous products and substances. Therefore, it's my conviction that all textiles, notably garments and footwear, should be one of the first product groups to be regulated under the eco-design regulation. Some of you may have seen that I have proposed amendments in my draft report of 6 December to prioritize textiles in the first eco-design working plan. It's also important to me that the social impacts of textiles are taken into consideration, which is why I have included also the possibility for the Commission to set requirements linked not only to environmental, but also social sustainability of products. When setting the eco-design requirements for the textile sector, it's important that the Commission addresses the sector comprehensively in order to tackle not only resource efficiency, but in particular the overproduction and overconsumption of textiles, which represent a major issue. In the new eco-design requirements for textiles, it will be important to extend the lifetime of clothing that can bring benefits for both the environmental and consumers. But I would like to hear, especially from the producers of textiles, what concrete measures you consider to be the most effective ways to address the underlying issues of overproduction and overconsumption of textiles. The overconsumption of new textiles largely depends on the high availability of the products, short fashion cycles, and the low pricing of the textiles. In my view, one way to tackle this overproduction and consumption is to ensure that all produced textiles will ultimately have to be put to use. This is why in my report I have decided to introduce an immediate ban on the destruction of unsold textile products. The destruction of unsold goods is a nonsense from an environmental point of view. And for the textile sector, there is already evidence of the magnitude of the phenomenon. Another important novelty introduced by the eco-design regulation is the digital product passport, which should play an important role in increasing transparency and providing information across the value chains, such as on the used materials and chemicals, but ideally also information on social aspects like working conditions. As Scalia said before, the digital product passport should also facilitate the role of the market surveillance authorities and customs authorities in enforcing the legislation, limiting the widespread import of non-compliant products, in particular from online marketplaces. I'm confident that the eco-design regulation can significantly contribute to sustainability of textile. A paradigm shift in the fashion and textile industry is needed to end overproduction and to make fast fashion out of fashion. I look forward to hearing the other speakers' views on how we can make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. We continue with Bente, who, as I said, is presenting Policy Hub, and with that presenting 50% of the global sector, which is, I think, still a big, good perspective we can hear now. Which leads me to the question: how do you perceive the proposal of the eco-design regulation, and what do you think still is needed from your perspective?
Thanks, Delara, and thanks to all the speakers already sharing their perspective. Let me firstly start with saying that I think this event or the discussion of also the EU textile strategy has been much anticipated. I mean, since 2018, we had first conversations around this, and now finally we can also meet in a room to discuss this important effort. Let me start with saying that indeed we are very supportive actually of this systemic approach that is being taken, because I think one point is important to keep in mind for the textile sector, which is that the issues we face, we cannot address them in isolation. And I will try to illustrate that a bit further in what I mean, because I think when we all talk about a coherent policy framework, there's always the question, what does that actually mean? And I want to explain that a bit more. Because obviously the ESPR, now to also address your question, will be a crucial file for the sector. And I think all the previous speakers have already shared their perspective on how this will change or basically put sustainable products on EU markets. But now concretely on how this is just one piece of the puzzle, I want to give you a few examples. So if we look at all the different performance requirements that are proposed in the draft ESPR regulation, we see, for example, recycled content requirements. And of course, this is a good way also to, basically promote lower impact fibers. However, we have one big challenge, and I think we need to be honest also in addressing that, which is that there is currently no functioning market for secondary raw materials, providing those materials at a price competitive as a competitive price to all market actors. And if we really are asking all producers to, use recycled content, we need to make sure that this is actually available to them. So this is one of the interlinkages of the ESPR with also some of the other discussions, Waste Framework Directive more specifically in this case, or EPR. And what we therefore suggested is actually to address that bottleneck also in opening up for other lower impact materials to be used. And that was also, I think, already nicely portrayed by Lars, that there are different trade-offs of different materials, and we should take the holistic picture also when we talk about materials and the impact they have. However, this is just one point. I think the other point already mentioned by Matthias is the single market. Again, making it a bit more concrete, or trying to make it more concrete. We currently see a lot of national initiatives mushrooming out in the EU, and we do not question the ambition of those national initiatives. However, this creates sometimes, let's say, confusing or even contradicting situations. So we have initiatives on transparency, traceability, on EPR, all across the EU member states. And what this sometimes creates is that, that either companies have to navigate contradicting requirements. So one thing that will be required in one country, member state might not be allowed in the other. Or more concretely, there's no incentive actually for companies to also implement some or comply with some of those requirements. If you have EPR schemes that differ significantly in all different member states, well, what will you do as a company basically selling products on all those different markets? You will have to try to, well, find a common ground. And then you might just have, yeah, a one guideline you will follow. So this is just one of the impacts that the single market have. But also one point that was mentioned before, and I don't remember who said that, but let's keep in mind that, of course, we have an EU industry, and yes, there is production here, and yes, companies selling products on the EU market will be impacted, but they have also suppliers in third countries. So if we have different data requests, information requirements, and what companies will do, they will of course ask their suppliers in third countries for such information. And if you multiply for a supplier the number of clients with the number of information requests per member state, you might end up with very inefficient situation where you basically have to navigate all these different information you will need to, or will be asked for. Then finally, just 2 points, and I think not repeating too much what has been already said. The textile sector represents a large diversity of actors, and so do we. We have sports brands, fashion brands, large to small, operating in various different business models. And it's important to keep in mind that they also have different needs and realities they're operating in. And it's, I think sometimes we talk about the textile sector, but it might be a bit of a large shot in terms of what that actually means. And then last but not least, the global nature of the value chain. As I mentioned already before, the EU textile strategy will put pressure on suppliers. I think it's something that has been mentioned before. They will have to provide information, they will have to well, implement certain measures potentially. And this requires actually capacity building and subsequently also a bit of time to make sure that we can work together with the partners in third countries to prepare all of what is coming ahead. And that's why one of the asks is also from us to really consider realistic implementation timelines. One other thing, and I think, again, it was mentioned in the previous panel, but is that some of the information points we're asking for now might not yet be fully available everywhere. So we can help also here to basically have one common set of global standards and information requirements to, again, just navigate the complexity that the partners and suppliers in third countries will have. And last but not least, when talking about successful legislation, and it has been mentioned now several times, the enforcement is key, and we need strong enforcement because in the end, yes, we can implement many beautiful legislations with a great ambition, but if they're not measurable, the requirements are not measurable, if we do not have strong and fully equipped member states, the ambition will be, well, the reality will not following suit the ambition. And I think I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bente, and for sharing your perspective, but of course also highlighting some of the challenges we have in a multi-level legislation making, like in the EU. I mean, in the end, Council, Commission, Parliament, and Council will sit together with the Council diversity of different standards where we are. So it's a really complex task. And thank you for sharing that perspective. We are moving to Emily. Emily, we heard from Lars in the first panel that the effects of the unsustainable textiles are harsh to the environment, to people. And of course, this is also some important aspect that we have to look at in the eco-design legislation. So the question would be, how can we make sure that the eco-design regulation delivers for environment and people, and that they don't have to pay the price of inaction, and what opportunities and challenges you see with that?
Thank you very much, Lara, and thanks for having the EB here represented on the panel. So, yeah, to answer your question, first of all, I can just start by saying a few words about where we're coming to this issue from and what our overall priority is when it comes to the ESPR and indeed the broader regulatory framework. So, from our perspective, we think it's really important to reduce the footprint of Europe's textile consumption in absolute terms. So that means that while we 100% support the need and the move to ensure that textiles being sold on the EU market comply with strong minimum standards, we also really think that, as has been said already by several speakers, it's really important to look at volumes and overproduction, because if we continue to produce more and more products, but the more the overall environmental and climate impact of these products will be compounded, regardless of how sustainable or otherwise these individual products might be. So, and this, of course, is all about bringing the footprint of the sector within planetary boundaries. And for us at the EB, this also means questioning economic growth, which is obviously a huge topic. So, but I just want to bring that onto the table, as this has also been identified as a high-level priority of the European Commission, to look at growth and going beyond economic indicators such as GDP. So I think that's going to be a key priority for fashion and textiles, is to look at how we deal with that, that issue. So, yes, and in that, talking about resource use reduction, of course, we support the inclusion of a resource use reduction target with specific objectives for the textile sector, and this was something that was missing in the textile strategy, so hopefully the Parliament can improve that in the opinion. So, so that's the sort of high-level picture, and then maybe specifically to answer your question, where we see how a resource use reduction approach, also with a just transition perspective, can actually be where the opportunities are when it comes to the eco-design for sustainable products regulation. So first huge priority is looking at online marketplaces, as has been mentioned by everyone else already on the panel. So what this means is that, as Mauro said, we have these 16 pieces of legislation, or 16 measures on the table. I hope you counted correctly, otherwise we're all repeating 16. Maybe it's more. So there's a lot happening. So we have to make sure that if we're going to all this effort and putting all this legislation and other measures onto the industry, that it's actually ensuring that the worst offenders are within the scope of the new rules. So, and where this links to the eco-design for sustainable products regulation is ensuring that online platforms are not allowed to bypass applicable laws and fiscal obligations, because they're acting, in some cases, like importers. So that means that they need to be classified as a type of economic operator, which would be subjected to action from market surveillance authorities, and also fully hear what has been said from other speakers as well about the need to bolster market surveillance for that to be possible. So yeah, as we know, loads of products are imported into the EU, including thousands of non-compliant products all the time. And there was a recent Greenpeace study which looked at Shein in particular, and found that 15% of the products that they analysed contained hazardous chemicals that breach EU rules. So on to my second point, also again looking to the ESPR,
the need to prohibit the destruction of unsold goods, I don't think needs any much more explanation. And this is also clearly linked to the prevalence of online marketplaces and the increase in returned goods through that business model. And also the bulk ordering, which is very much part and parcel of the sector. And I think a key point here would be to ensure that this ban is that SMEs are not exempt from this ban. And then my third point is to look at transparency. And again, in the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, we have the great opportunity with the Digital Product Passport. So we believe that this can be a really key opportunity to support full supply chain traceability, transparency, and facility disclosure. And this is a really important opportunity both from an environmental and a social perspective. So the Digital Product Passport can be a place where we can contain info and make publicly available information about supplier relationships. And this is important for due diligence, and also important when it comes to information, for example, on chemicals, because we know that brands themselves, there's a lot of pressure on brands to know about the chemical composure of their products, for example, but it's actually, as has also been mentioned, it's the suppliers which will have this information. And then also linking to chemicals through the Digital Product Passport, it seems to us that the ESPR ambition when it comes to hazardous chemicals is quite limited to looking at how to reduce hazardous chemicals that hamper recycling. So maybe this is a question, and also is something that we see as a regulatory gap. But we do also see that the Digital Product Passport, so there might not be so many opportunities, which is a shame, to look at hazardous chemicals prevention, but the Digital Product Passport does seem to be the place where we can increase information disclosure about the use of hazardous chemicals. And I touched on the fact that the Digital Product Passport has a real opportunity from an environmental and social perspective. And as has already been said, this is the problem of being the last speaker. The scope of the SPR, there's a discussion about to what extent it can include social sustainability. And for us, this is a key priority that it should include social sustainability, working conditions, and due diligence aspects, because clothes are made by people. So I think it's really important that we don't forget that aspect. And there's also a clear gap in the textile strategy when it comes to purchasing practices. But I won't say much more about that because that's already been said. But just to reiterate that I think this is somewhere where the Parliament can play a role in looking at those trade aspects. So I already mentioned chemicals and the need to solve that regulatory gap that seems to be there from our perspective, because obviously hazardous chemicals have huge impact on workers, on people, communities, and on all of us when we wear our clothes, and on the environment, particularly chemicals which persist in the environment for a long time. But responsible chemicals management is also a prerequisite for clean circular practices, because they will stick around. We want clothes to last forever, but then chemicals will also last forever. And just a few words on circularity, and then I'm nearly finished, don't worry. So it's really interesting to hear about the new EEA report on waste exports, because I think this is a real priority to stop used textiles being shipped from EU countries to third countries, because this really shifts the burden of our overconsumption onto the global south. Another point about circularity is really to use the opportunity to reform the Waste Framework Directive, to revise the Waste Framework Directive in the relevant articles when it comes to how we can set extended producer responsibility schemes to ensure that these support reuse and repair, and also support recycling when it comes to closing our own loop and using, and particularly fibre-to-fibre recycling. And then a very, very last point just on green claims, and then I'm finished. There's not so much to say because, as we know, we're waiting for the proposal to come out. But a really important point for us is that only reliable claims should be made and should be allowed, and that the methods that are used to substantiate claims need to be holistic and cover both environmental and social aspects. So happy to add more in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. But you were not the last speaker. We have Julia, who's speaking on behalf of the recyclers' perspective. I think it's a very important perspective, especially as we talked about the problem of recycling and only 1% of textiles being right now recycled. And also, of course, because we have a very important date coming, 25. Of course, the question on how products are designed is very important for the question to hit the targets of the recycling goals in 2025 and further. So I give you the word to share your perspective on what the ESPR has to deliver on that.
Thanks, Dilara. And as everyone said already, it's really great to be in a room with so many people passionate about sustainable textiles and circular textiles. So it's really, really nice to see you all. Just to mention, Jurek, Dilara said it already, we are a federation representing the recycling industry. So we represent the interests of the metal, paper, plastics, and tire recycling industry. But for textiles, it's actually on top of that. It's a bit more. Here we represent the whole recovery value chain. That means we start here with the collection of textiles, going to the sorting for reuse on the one side and recycling on the other side, but also, of course, mechanical and chemical recycling. So it's even a little bit more than just the classical paper or plastics recycling, which you may know for textiles. As Dilara said, a very, very important date coming our way, 2025. This is the date when we have to start in the EU collecting all our textile waste separately. So that means, of course, it will be a challenge for our sector because we know that the collection numbers will increase massively beyond that point. They're already pretty high, but after 2025, they will surely be even higher. And what we know, and recent studies have confirmed this, that the quality of what we collect or will collect after 2025 will also decrease at the same time. So this is really going to be a challenge, but can also be seen, of course, as an opportunity for our sector if we have those laws in place that actually will help our sector. And here I hope to not repeat too much because really being the last speaker, we have heard already a lot. But coming from the waste perspective, I want to focus as a first point, which is really, really important when we see those increased numbers coming in, that we have to respect the waste hierarchy. So you all know the waste hierarchy in the Waste Framework Directive. We have it already there for several years, and that everything that can be reused should be reused. This is really very, very important. And this, I feel like I'm the only one who's going to say this, but I also think that reuse should be domestically, but also globally. So here I think I heard Lars, I heard Emily just saying this, but I will come back to that point also later on because I think there is still a little understanding gap what is actually a used textile and what isn't. So this is really, really important, reuse, global, but of course also local. And then of course we have to divert as much as we can textile waste from landfill and incineration. And as much as possible has to go through fiber-to-fiber recycling, everything that cannot be reused. This is really, really very important. For the recycling part, what I haven't heard today, I heard for the ESPR, and now I'm coming to the ESPR because, of course, this is a very important piece of legislation on our tables, that the clothes have to be durable, recyclable, but so far I actually haven't heard that they also should be made with recycled content, which for our industry is really, really, really important. We do need mandatory recycled fiber-to-fiber content targets coming from the ESPR. We see it right now in the SUP directive, in the Single-Use Plastics Directive, which is the only directive that we have on a European level that has mandatory recycled content targets at the moment. We know batteries are coming and many, many more packaging, but I also think within the ESPR for textiles, the delegated act that hopefully will come up, we need recycled content targets for that as well, because we've seen during the COVID crisis and everything when oil was very cheap, PET bottles were still really, really, you could still really use recycled PET to make new bottles because it was mandated. And it was also, to answer maybe the question that came at the beginning, to have like pricing that was also price-wise equal to virgin fibers, to virgin PET. So that is really a good news. And then moving on to the revision of the Waste Framework Directive, which was also mentioned already before. This is for our industry, one of the most important pieces of legislation. Also currently, one of the 16 Mauro mentioned, one of the 16 pieces, one very, very important piece for our industry. And here what we think, or what we see, what we know is that EPR schemes, so extended producer responsibility, is in the focus. And here, just one little disclaimer, because we don't think that EPR is actually a silver bullet to solve all our problems. Within the big sphere of everything, of all legislative changes, of everything that needs to be done, EPR is one point. And EPR schemes should not be set up just because it's easy to set up EPR schemes, because it may help. It should only be done after a thorough analysis, because we really shouldn't set up EPR schemes just for the sake of setting up EPR schemes, only when it's really, really needed. But looking at textiles, at the probably increased number of collected textiles by 2025, we do think here it is really important. But of course, we have to make sure that then EPR schemes, and now I'm going to go a little bit nerdy into EPR schemes. I hope you can still follow. I know I'm the last one, and this is going to be a bit nerdy. But I'm going into the details of EPR schemes a little bit now, because only if it's properly set up and harmonized to a certain extent on European level, it actually makes sense to have EPR schemes. What is really important is that it should not be that second-hand textiles should actually not be subject to an EPR scheme. I know this isn't considered in the EU, or at least I hope it's not considered in the EU, but this would really be wrong in our opinion, because of course it would be a double contribution, because every second-hand textile was already a first-hand textile at some point and would have had already EPR contributions if you look at it that way. And then, of course, the contributions should support reuse and recycling activities, because especially when we look at the recycling side, we know there is a lot to do. Delara mentioned it before, only 1% fiber-to-fiber recycled. So this would be needed for that as well, but of course also for research and development, to have more recycling in the future. Very important point as well. And then we think that reuse and recycling businesses that comply with industry standards, only those should be eligible to receive EPR contributions, because there must be at some point industry standards, sorting, collecting requirements, and those should be the ones that can receive the funding, the EPR contributions. We heard it already. This goes back to ESPR. Eco-modulation, very, very important point. I'm not going into that to not repeat what everyone else said. But what is, and this is my last point on the EPR nerdy part, is that for us, it's very important, of course, the producer has to sit in an EPR scheme. I mean, it's called extended producer responsibility. That makes sense. But we also think that the end-of-life phase, so the recyclers, those who prepare for reuse, they have to have a sit at the table of EPR administration. This is currently the case, I believe, here in Belgium for the EPR schemes for end-of-life vehicles, but it's not normally the case. It is really only composed of producers, and then I always wonder, how can the end-of-life phase be properly represented if they don't sit in the administration? So this, for us, is a very crucial point that should be taken on board. And then last but not least, and I think this is the point when I come back to also what Lars said with maybe not exporting used textiles out of the EU, we actually don't know when something is a textile waste and when it is a second-hand textile at the moment. This is a big problem. I mean, we all have an assumption when this should be the case, but we don't have any guidance. I know the textile strategy has set forward to bring a guidance at some point, and we see this as very important, because if I look at, Lars, what you showed on your slide before, you used the HS codes 6309 and 6310. Those HS codes for shipments of used textiles, you may ship a used textile, a second-hand good, that is very easy to wear still for years and years to come to, let's just say it, to Africa, or you ship a textile waste, because there is no distinction in law yet when something is a second-hand good and when it is a waste, so to declare it once you ship it out. And we do need the separation to make sure that textile waste doesn't end up somewhere where it shouldn't be. But, and I think this is very important, also reusable textiles are needed in other countries outside the EU, because maybe they are cheaper than buying primary materials. So I think also from a social aspect, this should not be just because we all know the pictures. Let's face it, we all know the pictures of Ghana and the beaches, but maybe if we have a proper framework, this will not happen anymore because we only ship what can actually be reworn again and is also needed in those countries. So this, for me, is a very, very crucial aspect, what we will need, a proper distinction when something is a waste versus when it's not, because, of course, also the legal consequences are completely different. You have different laws in place when you ship under waste legislation, for instance. Then just to mention what we also need, and this is really my last point, that a textile waste should be able to leave the waste status. So it should not always be a textile waste. If you have a proper sorting that has maybe standardized rules or whatever, then it should be able to leave the waste status. If a textile has been properly recycled, it should also leave the waste status. For this, we need the support also of end-of-waste criteria, which we see right now work very well for metals, for certain metals. We have it on European level, as well as for glass colored. So these are really important points that we need to consider going forward. But thankfully, I know we are also will look here in the EU also at end-of-waste. So I hope this will be tackled then. So really, to summarize, I think what we do need is a very, very strong legislative framework to support the collection and sorting, and also to really what we do already for decades, collection and sorting, but also to scale up the textile recycling, because the numbers that are coming our way will be really massive, and we do need those both parts, reuse and recycling, in order to tackle it all. So I really look forward to the discussions now and keep it here. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia, for also sharing this important perspective, and of course also the very concrete points that we can take to the process. So, as you know, the game from before, we are now heading to the Q&A session. Just to give you a transparency hint, we have 15 minutes left, which of course makes it hard to have 2 rounds. So I will, if okay with the panelists, take 5 questions, and then we look where we are, and then maybe take 1 more, and then we have a bigger round. So it's puts the, yeah, and if you question asking people, check that you make short questions or avoid comments, have short questions, and address them maybe to the speaker you want to have the answer from. You already had, so I will take a new, no, you didn't, okay. Then I will take you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm Delphine from Fashion Revolution. So I just wanted also to thank the previous panel for plugging in our living wage campaign called Good Clothes Fair Pay. So if you haven't already, please go and check out our website. I just had a few comments as well regarding one aspect that hasn't really been mentioned. So we mentioned living wages, fair pay for garment workers. However, what we can see as well within the fashion industry is the pay ratio and the fact that the fashion industry is also a huge culprit regarding financial inequality and power imbalances within its own operations as well. When we have fashion executives earning, I think, a pay ratio of 6,000 to 1, I also think that's something that we need to start questioning as well. And regarding fiscal obligations, I also think that's something that the European Commission and the European Parliament should start considering, given that just a case study that came out last year found that I think 40% of disqualified directors based in Leicester, which is the biggest garment hub in the UK, were linked to the fashion industry. So again, I don't think it's by chance that the fashion industry is a huge culprit when it comes down to tax evasion. So I think that's also something that should be discussed when we are starting to regulate the fashion industry. So just wanted to make this quick point. Secondly, regarding transparency, I think it's absolutely key when we start talking about environmental impacts of textiles, that we also start looking at suppliers lists and publicly available disclosure on these, given that if we do not have visibility of these, we cannot remedy and we can't also understand what the actual impacts are. Having visited a lot of factories, I know for a fact that a lot of these factories do not actually track their energy consumption, their water consumption, their waste production, and I think that should be compulsory given the complexity of the fashion industry. So I just wanted to flag that as well. So I'll pass it on to the next question.
Thank you, Delphi. You ahead, yeah. With the cardigan.
Thank you very much. I'm Teresa from Zero Waste Europe. I'd like to pick up on something that MEP Moretti mentioned, that is that eco-design is supposed to tackle overproduction, overconsumption that's driven by ever-shortening fashion cycles. As this is a legislation that's very much targeting the product itself, I was wondering how can it also kind of challenge the short fashion cycles, which are probably more down to the marketing strategy or the business model, and perhaps what other piece of legislation could tackle this. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Then we have you in the black shirt.
Sorry. I'm Andrea Masotto from the European Footwear Confederation, and I would just to raise the point that footwear is also in the scope of the textile strategy, and as a consequence of the eco-design regulation. But also in this discussion, we only talk about textiles, fibers. We talk about recycled content. We talk about second-hand. We talk waste management, and we talk only about textile and clothing. But the footwear products are much more complex. They require different model. Even when we talk about waste management, sorting all the different components is not as easy as when it comes to clothing. Recycling is not always possible. For example, at present, there are still no ways to eliminate all the hazardous substances absorbed by the source. And in general, also when we talk about eco-design, we cannot just change materials as it comes, because eco-design for footwear needs to consider also other elements, for example, health standards. So, well, these are solutions that they are still not existing. The sector is working on that. As a confederation, we are engaged in many high-level initiatives and also to research and innovation projects. Our members at the local level, they are engaging in pilot projects for waste management or for eco-design, or for the use of new materials. But yeah, we need more time, we need more knowledge, and we need, most of all, investment. So I would like to ask you to reconsider when you talk about prioritization of footwear, and in order, because the risk is that the sector will have a new legislation that cannot comply to, not because of the lack of will, but because of the lack of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? You in the green shirt.
Hello, my name is Sophia Krügel. I'm representing Independent Retail Europe. That's the association in Brussels for cooperative retailers who operate online but also offline. And I have a remark on what Ms. McIntosh said on market surveillance, followed by a question to Mr. Malgash and Ms. Moretti. I would like to say that on market surveillance, we see a couple of obligations for distributors. For example, the obligation to indicate the batch number at the moment of the online offer to facilitate market surveillance. However, market surveillance does not work with a batch number, and this will actually be really burdensome for retailers who would have, on the one hand, a warehouse system and a web shop that communicate, which is not the case right now. It would also require retailers to scan individually every item and enter the batch number in the warehouse system, because the current barcodes do not indicate the batch numbers. So this would require a lot of workload. And we also see that in the context of the recently published General Product Safety Regulation that is adopted in Parliament and the Council, that the exact same provision that was proposed in that context has been deleted from the proposal. So we would like to see maximum alignment with the recently published General Product Safety Regulation in that regard, and that is, to be precise, the Article 31.c. And I would like to ask Mr. Malgash and Ms. Moretti if this is a project for legislators at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we take one last question in the back.
Thank you. I'm Estefania Jimenez. I represent Municipal Waste Europe. Our members are local authorities working on their responsibility on waste management. So I just wanted to quickly comment, underline what Mrs. Julia Bles said before. We have to be very careful when setting up an extended producer responsibility, because we know that municipalities are not always involved in the governance bodies. So we are looking at the revision of the Waste Framework Directive on this particular aspect, but I wanted to ask a question on the revision of the eco-design regulation. Would like to know the panelists' opinion on the possibility to introduce a ban on design practices that make products prematurely obsolete. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry that I now have to close the Q&A, but we need answers to the questions that have been raised, and we are running out of time, but there will be time to exchange after the event. So let me start with Matthias with the first round.
Thanks a lot. I'd like to take a few questions. One was on how does actually regulation interact with the fact that one of the problems we have is that fashion is fast. I think it came from there. Sorry, I didn't pick up the name. I think, as everything we said today, we all understand we have to work in a systemic way. What we can do with the regulation, though, is if we make sure that, A, people understand, so information, people understand what the consequences are, so those who want to make a choice can make a choice that is more sustainable. B, making things more durable or more repairable will keep them inevitably longer in the market, reduce the need to buy new stuff. And what I hope, this is my personal opinion, is, and this is what we already see, is that will create new business models, because basically the companies have to increasingly think how to make money out of things that last longer, rather than just to sell new stuff and encourage them to throw them away. So I think that should be an incentive that will be provided there. But a lot will come from what many of you mentioned, outside regulatory framework. I already see with my kids or my younger siblings that they already buy a lot of used stuff. They don't want to buy things. They don't want to throw them away. So my jacket is just because I'm old-fashioned, and that's why that's there. So that would be on this. Then second question was on transparency, which I think was a broader question on transparency. But again, here I want to mention two things that ESPR can bring. One, through information that will be available about different parts of the supply chain, you will gain better transparency where it is needed. So there we have to be transparent. Proposal doesn't mean that everything from a company level would be available to everybody, but whenever information is relevant for consumers' decisions, it should be there. And second thing, several of you mentioned destruction of goods. What we proposed is actually to have full transparency, that all the companies that do destroy unsold goods do have to disclose those facts. So there, what we are hoping for is not disclose those facts, but actually disclose all the numbers. So what we're hoping for there is the incentive for them to be seen by the consumers, what they do, and actually work in a right way. On a question of footwear, which I think brings the bigger question on how can you actually have measures that fit all? We don't foresee measures that fit all. Textile is a big sector. So what we are actually doing now, we already started working, as we promised in the textile strategy. We're already working in scoping in what would be best placed, homogeneous group of textiles for which we have sufficient information that we can start developing measures for. So this is this is the work that will be done very transparently in full consultation with general public, and you will see more about this towards the end of January when the Commission publishes the consultation on the first list of priorities. So my answer is not, no, we will not do anything on footwear. All I'm saying is that for whatever subcategory, what we're looking for is to make an impact, and to make an impact means you have to have sufficient information to develop measures that can be applied. So we'll be working hard on filling the information gaps, but it doesn't mean that we would overnight come with proposals for something that's completely impossible to do. So that's a bit the message. That's not footwear specific, but that goes for all products. And then finally, I tried to quickly look, but it exceeded my ability to analyze 6 articles on 31. Actually, that was a question that had to do with batches. I mean, from what I remember, we don't foresee specific obligations at the batch level. When we introduce obligations for DPP, we say that we would do it at an appropriate level. So sometimes it would be product, which is in cases of more expensive things, because that's doable. And sometimes it would have to be batch because the product itself is too cheap to impose this obligation. So if you have a not our priority, but you have a T-shirt, you wouldn't foresee that every T-shirt has to be entered in a system, whereas if you have €1,000 worth PlayStation, that would make sense to have it individually. And I think I'll stop here because I already spoke a lot in introduction.
Thank you, Matthias. Then we turn over to the Parliament, to Alessandra.
Yes, thank you. I will answer in my language, Italian, for your answers. And so, io sono convinta che...
Well, I'm convinced that if we're able to achieve progress in every industry, well, education is really at the heart of that. So, if what we want is a holistic approach, as has rightly been underscored, we need to really work to have a mindset shift in our culture. This obviously involves young people. Young people, after all, are the future, it goes without saying, of all our countries, and then they're the ones who are going to be making decisions about policy. So we need to look at the role of schools in this regard. The role of the cultural messaging coming out of the institutions on these matters, because obviously it's not just about the quality of the product, it's much broader than that. We need to work on educating consumers and raising awareness to get consumers to be on the lookout for sustainable products and to seek them. Then there's the matter of models, the different models that can be used in terms of policy, but also if you look at, for instance, what can be done with testimonials. It's about fashion, about trends after all. A new way of being fashionable. There's something my grandmother used to say to me actually. It's a joke, an expression, which obviously came from 2 or 3 generations ago. She'd say, "You get what you pay for." Also going back to your jacket there, right? After all, fashion is cyclical. Things always come back into fashion. So quality of products is really at the heart of that. I mean, I've got clothes that belong to my mum and that are back in fashion now. If those clothes are good quality, well, they can go on to be worn for a really long time. So my view is that what we need to bring together is quality and sustainability. If you've got a good quality product, that means that it's going to be long lasting. And it's about making that product more attractive to young people in particular. And once that's done, of course, there's a great deal of work to be done. To go back to the other question that was asked, we need to work not just with businesses, we also need to work with suppliers. We need to work on the kind of message that we're sending out to people producing outside of the EU. And they need to be working to the same security and safety standards as within the EU as well. And just to go to the last question now, our legislative consistency. As lawmakers, our role is to simplify norms and rules. It's not about more of a burden. It's not about making things more difficult for people who need to comply with that legislation. It's about ensuring that our regulations are consistent with what's been done up until now, but we also need to take into account the fact that policy needs to be flexible. Policy needs to respond to changes, not just set out the framework for changes to come. Just here to refer to something Dilara often says. It's about a long-term vision for our future, being able to anticipate, not just running after what's going on with tweaks that arise in the face of what's happening in society. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. I think in German you would say, kaufst du billig, kaufst du zweimal. You buy cheap, you buy twice, which of course also puts on one important social aspect, because what we want to achieve with the regulation that sustainable textiles become affordable and accessible for everyone and not for just a few people. So thank you for that, putting that in our remembrance. I would continue with Bente.
Coming back to the questions, just to emphasize 2 points, I think. I would like to get back to the footwear concern, and I think that's one overarching challenge that I think also comes up in this conversation. The sector is regulated for the first time, but there's still so many different nuances and understandings on what we're actually talking about. And indeed, for some regulations, footwear is included, for others it's out. I think there's a massive patchwork only on scoping and defining on what we're talking about. And yeah, that's a massive task. I'm sure that at least from the sector side, we want to support that conversation. But there's still, I think, a lot of work to be done to really understand what we're talking about, what should be legislated under what file and how. That's the one point. The second point, again, more covering the global dimension, and the point I think that was brought by Fashion Revolution. Indeed, there's still a lot of work to be done globally with the suppliers. And just to repeat also the call that I brought earlier, let's not think that we're just the EU and not connected to the global market. There's one point we can, of course, further discuss, and Dilara, you already hinted at it. The EU can take a leadership role in this, but also let's treat our partners and suppliers elsewhere truly as partners and not as, well, going there with demands and lists.
Important aspect. Thank you, Bente. Then we go to Emily.
Yeah, so just picking up on the question from Zero Waste Europe about how to tackle marketing. So I think that this is a huge issue. I think all of us know that fashion products in particular are very visible everywhere you go in the physical world. Marketing of fashion products is staring at you in the face, as well as in the online world. And as I mentioned in my intervention, I think this links to the need for the eco-design framework to not leave out online marketplaces. And also maybe we need to discuss more how the power of social media platforms in driving consumption. And then I think this also links to ongoing discussion about the concept that's sometimes known as emotional durability. So this means that we know that overconsumption is not necessarily driven because products are lacking in functional durability, because they're beyond repair. It's because of opportunity and marketing and oversupply and the availability of cheap products. So yeah, I think this is really important and is something that should be enhanced in the Parliament's response. It could be enhanced in the Parliament's response. And yes, just to echo what's been said by Bente about footwear and the difficulty, which I think is very interesting how it has come up by many times throughout the afternoon, the issue of scope and which products we're talking about, which part of the industry, which supply chain, which region. I think that shouldn't be something that puts us off because I think there is a need to look at all the different aspects. We just need to be really clear what we're talking about, who we're talking about, what we mean by fast fashion. And I think that, yeah,
I don't have a perfect answer to how we tackle that, but I think it's going to need more collaboration, more discussion, and more discussions like this, but really targeted on specific aspects. And as I imagine this is our last intervention, so maybe I can just quickly say that if you see on the table, you might have look out for this piece of paper. This is 12 points from seven civil society organisations. We put together 12 points, priorities, which we think MEPs, we would like them to consider for the textile strategy, INE, and so please don't hesitate to have a look and get in touch with any of us if you want to discuss on more of those points. And for us, it's really important. As you'll see, we're a group of environmental and social organisations, and coming together because, as has been said already, the need to have a just transition and that it's really a combined, fair and sustainable response. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. Last but not least, Julia.
Thanks, Dilara. I diligently wrote down all your questions, and no one wanted to talk with me about waste, but that's all right. I talk about waste all day long, so that's fine. So I'm just not going to answer any questions, but what I wanted to say, and I take this home because I think all of us sitting here see it in the same way. It's very nice to see how much we all have in common, no matter where you are in the textile value chain, but we all have one common goal: to make textiles more sustainable, more circular. And I think this is really a very nice takeaway, realizing that I'm really the last speaker now. So I think to take it to that very high level, I was really happy to be here and to really have that feeling going home now that we all work towards the same direction, and together we can make a difference, and I think we will. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia, and I'm happy to continue talking about waste with you, maybe then on another point. So that leaves me for this panel. Thank you so much for the really, I mean, my head is really making, how you say, pirouettes, because there was so much good inputs, and I think we can really work a lot with that. I wanted, for my part, to thank you for the two panels. I advise you to tune in tomorrow in the ENVI committee, where we will have the debates in the committee. I want to thank all 120 people in the room, 180 online, so we were 300 people today, which I think is also showing how much interest there is. And I would close with, for me, then I will pass over to Alessandra for the closing remarks, to our ENVI team, to Marta from my team for organizing this event, and of course for everyone who contributed. And then I pass over to Alessandra.
Thank you, Dilara, and thank you all for such a comprehensive and engaging discussion this afternoon. This was highly informative and has given me a much more clearer insight into the challenges and opportunities that we have ahead of us. There is clearly a lot of work ahead of us in the Parliament on the eco-design dossier and the sustainable textiles strategies, not to mention all the other connected files to ensure that we can effectively and rapidly transition to sustainable textiles marking sustainable products, the norm in the EU. On the eco-design regulation, as you know, we are in the beginning of the process and have a long way ahead of us in the Parliament and eventually in the negotiations with the Council, but I'm confident that we together will be able to submit a very progressive piece of legislation. I would like to stress, however, the importance to remain aware of the overlaps between the eco-design legislation and other relevant EU regulations, directives and initiatives on textile, packaging, chemicals, as well as with horizontal initiatives on waste, green claims and empowering on consumers. Ensuring harmonization among all the initiative will be of utmost importance in developing a workable and effective framework for textiles that work for the planet and users and business. Thank you to all your and our great panelists, and thank you to everyone to taking part in the discussion. I look forward to working together in the future on this topic, including as the eco-design file develops. Before concluding the meeting, I would like to remind you that after our workshop, there is the possibility to sign the petition Good Clothes, Fair Pay, a campaign demanding living wage legislation across the garment, textile, and footwear sector, and the possibility to take a picture. So thank you very much and see you soon. Good job.